The night was still, yet Richard's heart refused to rest. In the silence of his office, questions lingered like shadows, whispering doubts he could no longer ignore. The safe sat open behind him, its contents untouched, glowing under the faint light, like a secret waiting to be discovered. He had built an empire on trust, but something inside him whispered that loyalty was slipping through unseen cracks. And in that fragile silence, a revelation began to take shape. What would you do if the very foundation of your world was being stolen piece by piece, not by strangers, but by those closest to you? How would you react if betrayal wore the face of a friend, smiling while tightening the knife behind your back? Perhaps you'd cling to denial, or perhaps, like Richard, you'd be forced to stare into the abyss of deception and decide whether truth was worth the cost. In the end, the answer comes not from comfort, but from courage, the kind that leaves scars. This story is not about numbers on a page, nor is it about victories written in contracts. It's about lives weighed down by silence, about a leader who discovered that the true measure of power is not wealth, but the ability to protect. What unfolds here is a tale of betrayal and redemption, of broken trust and fragile hope stitched back together. And if you stay with me, you'll see that sometimes the darkest secrets bring forth the most powerful lesson. So lean in, listen closely. For within these walls lies a story few ever witness, one that cuts deeper than figures and profit. It is a rare glimpse into the cost of loyalty betrayed, the resilience of dignity tested, and the courage it takes to stand when everything is falling apart. Richard's journey is not just his, it is a mirror, reflecting the hidden battles we all carry in silence. And now, as the first light of truth flickers, you are invited to walk beside him. Step into the shadows where deception thrives and watch as courage forces the darkness into the open. This is more than a story, it is a revelation, and it begins here. He arrived before dawn, and the building felt like a stage waiting for the first light. Richard walked the corridor as if the walls were listening for secrets. He paused at the office door and steadied his breath like a man about to dive. Trust had started to feel like glass under his shoes. He unlocked the safe and left it ajar with a quiet click that echoed. An envelope of cash sat inside like bait in still water. He stepped back and let the silence thicken around the room. Somewhere in that silence, he hoped the truth would finally speak. He had built the company with stubborn hands and a head that would not quit. Years had taught him that people shine when they feel seen. They also taught him that shadows grow where fear takes root. The small losses had begun as whispers no one could place, receipts did not match, and petty cash kept limping. He ran the numbers until sleep turned into a stranger. He wanted to believe in his people, and he still did. Yet belief without proof had started to feel like a blindfold. The plan was simple and awful and necessary. Leave the safe open and watch what the day revealed. He hated that it had come to this strange theater. He hated the thought of catching anyone with their hand shaking. Still, he knew a wound ignored will not close. He set the phone to record the room from a clean angle. He stepped into the next office with the door almost closed. He listened to the air as if the air could confess. Mary arrived with her quiet cart and her careful rhythm. She wiped the glass and lined up frames as if dignity were a straight line. She hummed a tired tune that slipped in and out of key. The city outside moved like a distant tide. She had learned to be invisible so others could feel important. She noticed everything and spoke of little work gave her order. When life refused to give much else, she kept her head down and her heart tucked away. The open safe caught her eye like a flare in fog. Her steps slowed and the cart wheels squeaked and went still. She glanced toward the hallway and heard only the hush. Her hand hovered near the door and pulled back as if from a hot stove. Temptation arrived like a whisper with cold hands. Need answered with a louder whisper that felt like a cry. She blinked hard and bit the inside of her cheek. She knew right from wrong, and the knowing hurt. She looked inside and her breath stuttered. The envelope sat heavy as if it had a pulse. Her fingers did not touch it, and yet it felt close. A tear slipped free before she could catch it. Another followed and turned the floor into a blur. She pressed her palm to her mouth as if to hold in a storm. Words shook loose that she had tried to keep locked away. She said she had not been paid for 3 months. From the doorway, Richard felt something inside him tilt. Guilt struck first for testing a good heart, then confusion rushed in like fast water. How could anyone in his house go unpaid? What kind of rot had spread under his feet? He stepped out slow so he would not startle her. His voice came, quiet like a hand offered in the dark. He asked her to breathe and tell him everything she could. Mary wiped her face with the back of her wrist. She kept her gaze low, as if looking at pain made it smaller. She explained that promises had turned to smoke at payroll. Each week had come with excuses that sounded official. She had waited because pride can be a stubborn guard. She had borrowed because hunger does not bargain. She had worked because stopping felt like letting go of herself. She said, the money in the safe did not belong to her, and never would Richard felt anger rise, and he told it to sit. He asked who had been handling the payments and the explanations. A name formed on her lips and trembled there. She spoke it soft, like someone afraid the walls might answer back. He heard it and felt the floorboards change under his shoes. He thought of records and signatures and rules turned into weapons. He thought of the trust that used to feel like sunlight. He understood that the honest test had uncovered a deeper well. Mary nodded and said there was more he needed to hear. Her voice thinned as if the words were walking through winter. She glanced at the clock and flinched at the time she could not afford. She asked if they could speak somewhere safer than an open doorway. Richard guided her toward the office with the half-closed door. The safe stayed open behind them like a mouth that had spoken. The day had only just begun, and already it was heavier than stone. What waited in her next breath would turn weight into a story with teeth. Mary sat with her hands folded tight, the way someone holds on to what little they have left. Her eyes carried the mark of long nights where sleep was a stranger and hunger a guest that stayed too long. When she spoke, her voice trembled like glass about to break. She confessed that her mother was ill, her body refusing to fight without the medicine she could no longer afford. Each sentence was carved out of pain she had been hiding, and Richard listened as though the walls themselves might collapse under the weight of her truth. Her story unfolded with the slow gravity of loss. She had once lived in a modest house that smelled of coffee in the morning and echoed with her mother's laughter. But one overdue bill after another pushed her closer to the edge, until the day the locks changed and her keys became useless metal. She moved through borrowed couches, through rooms that never felt like home, clinging to dignity that poverty tried to strip from her. Richard realized this was not just hardship, it was the unraveling of a life. She spoke of wages promised but never delivered, of standing in line at the pharmacy only to walk away empty-handed. Her mother's medicine sat on shelves out of reach, each pill a reminder that time was slipping away. She said she worked every day not because she believed she would be paid, but because work was all she had left of her own worth. Her words did not accuse, they simply bled, leaving silence in their wake that was heavier than any accusation could be. Richard's chest tightened as he heard the quiet courage in her voice. She had not stolen, though need clawed at her daily. She had not quit, though despair whispered she should. Instead, she chose to keep pushing the cart, keep polishing the glass, keep holding the company together in her small way. He saw in her not weakness, but a strength he himself might not have possessed in her place. The safe had not revealed a thief, but a woman drowning while pretending to walk upright. It was not only Mary, but as her voice grew steadier, as if sharing the burden made it lighter. Other employees had whispered the same complaints in dark corners, away from the ears of power. They too had gone months without pay, their loyalty weaponized against them. They too had been fed promises like crumbs, never enough to survive on. Richard's stomach turned as he realized the scope of the wound spreading through his company, festering in silence. Mary hesitated before speaking Mark's name, as though saying it might summon him. She explained how he cornered workers, waved documents in their faces, claimed to hold proof of thefts that never happened. He told them to stay quiet, to endure the missing paychecks, or risk being branded as criminals. Some believed him, others were too afraid to resist. In their fear, They had chosen silence, and silence had allowed his power to grow unchecked. Richard felt betrayal take root like fire. She described the moments of humiliation, choosing between food and bus fare, avoiding neighbors who asked too many questions, pretending that everything was fine while the ground crumbled beneath her feet. Her eyes grew darker when she admitted she sometimes skipped meals so her mother could eat. Yet through it all, she kept working, polishing, cleaning, hoping that someday someone would notice the injustice hanging in the air like smoke after a fire. Richard noticed now, but it already felt too late. The more she spoke, the clearer it became that Mark's shadow had stretched across every corner of the company. He had not just stolen money, he had stolen trust, hope, and the simple dignity of honest work. Richard clenched his jaw, not out of anger at Mary, but at himself for not seeing sooner he had trusted the wrong man while ignoring the quiet suffering of those who built his dream day by day. The realization felt like salt on an open wound. Mary's tears slowed, replaced by a strange calm. She said she had prayed for someone to listen, for someone to look past the polish of the office floors and see the cracks beneath. She did not expect the owner himself to be that someone. For a moment her voice softened, and Richard heard not just pain, but a spark of hope that perhaps the tide could still be turned. That hope, fragile as it was, struck him harder than all her suffering. As the room grew still, Richard knew the test he had set had revealed more than he bargained for. It was no longer about missing cash, but about broken lives and stolen futures. Mary's confession was a key that unlocked a hidden door, one that would lead him into shadows far darker than he had imagined. He sat there, heart pounding, realizing that the real theft had not been from the safe, but from the souls of the people he had promised to protect. Richard did not sleep that night. His mind kept circling around Mary's words, replaying them with the sharpness of broken glass. He sat in his office long after the lights had gone out across the city, studying files, receipts, and reports that once seemed flawless. Now every page looked suspicious, every signature too neat, every number a mask for something darker. The silence of the building pressed in on him, and for the first time, he wondered how deep the betrayal might go. The next morning, he approached the accounting department with a calm face that hid the storm inside. He requested copies of payroll records, expense sheets, and internal transfers. The staff obeyed, unaware of the reason behind his sudden interest. Richard carried the stack back to his office, his hands trembling as though he held not paper, but proof of sins. He spread them across his desk like puzzle pieces, searching for the thread that tied them together. It did not take long. Transfers that should have gone to employees' accounts had been rerouted. The names were correct, but the account numbers led somewhere else entirely. At first glance, it looked like clerical error, the kind of slip anyone might make, but the pattern was too precise, too repeated, too calculated. Richard felt a chill as he traced the trail again. Each false account, another blade cutting into the trust he thought was unshakable. The more he dug, the clearer the picture became. Mark had constructed a web, delicate and cruel. He had set up accounts under names that mimicked real employees, using details only someone on the inside would know. Salaries that should have gone to the cleaners, the assistants, the secretaries, had flowed into his hidden channels. Meanwhile, the workers were silenced with threats, their voices smothered by the weight of fabricated evidence. Richard's stomach clenched with disgust. He could see now how Mark had managed to maintain his facade. Whenever suspicions arose, he produced forged documents, immaculate in detail, pointing blame toward innocent hands. He used his authority like a weapon, crafting fake records of theft, whispering rumors into ears that were too tired or too afraid to resist. By the time anyone questioned him, they already feared being exposed as criminals. It was manipulation at its most poisonous, and it had thrived under Richard's nose. Richard's heart sank as he remembered the trust he had placed in Mark for 15 years. They had shared victories, toasted deals, spoken about family as if they were brothers. Now those memories felt like lies painted over a rotting wall. He wondered how long Mark had been building this empire of deceit, how many times he had smiled in Richard's face while tightening the noose around the company's neck. The thought left him cold. One document in particular shattered what little doubt remained. A transfer order signed with Richard's name, authorizing the rerouting of funds. But the signature, though perfect, was not his. Mark had not only stolen from the workers, he had stolen Richard's identity, turning him into a scapegoat for crimes he had never committed. The betrayal stung like a knife twisted slowly, deeper with every turn of the page. Richard sat back, staring at the papers spread before him, the evidence undeniable. Anger coursed through him, but beneath it was grief. Grief for the company he thought he knew, for the people he had failed, and for the friendship that had been nothing but a mask. He realized that exposing this fraud would not be simple. Mark had woven his lies too tightly, hidden too well. To unravel it, Richard would need courage, cunning, and allies he was not sure he still had. Yet, in that moment, Richard made a silent vow. He would not allow this web to suffocate the company any longer. He would tear it apart thread by thread, no matter how long it took. He owed that to Mary, to the employees who had suffered, and to himself. The truth was no longer just an obligation. It had become a fire in his chest, one that demanded release. And so, as the sun dipped behind the skyline, Richard locked the office door and gathered the papers into a single file. He knew that every step from here would be dangerous, that Mark would not surrender easily. But he also knew the fraud had been revealed, and once seen, it could not be unseen. What mattered now was how far he was willing to go to bring it all into the light. Richard waited until the office was quiet before summoning Mark. The man walked in with his usual confident stride, the kind of ease that comes from years of trust unbroken. His smile was steady, his voice calm, but Richard could no longer see him the same way. Every gesture, every word, carried the echo of deceit. Richard laid the forged documents on the table between them, watching carefully for the first crack in Mark's mask. Mark glanced at the papers, then back at Richard, his brow furrowed in practiced confusion. He denied everything with the smoothness of someone who had rehearsed for this very moment. His tone was indignant, wounded even, as though the accusation itself was the real crime. He leaned forward, voice rising, asking how Richard could think such things after 15 years of loyalty. But Richard noticed the faint twitch in his jaw, the small betrayals the body cannot hide. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. Richard did not shout. He simply pushed forward another sheet, then another, each piece of evidence like a stone dropped into still water. Account numbers, false transfers, fabricated receipts, and finally, the forged signature. With every new page, Mark's protests grew thinner, his anger sharper, until the calm facade began to slip. His eyes darted, searching for escape, for a narrative to hold on to. When Richard mentioned Mary, Mark froze. It was only for a second, but the stillness was telling. Richard pressed on, his voice steady, naming the employees who had come forward, recounting the stories of unpaid wages and veiled threats. Mark laughed nervously, dismissing them as liars, as people looking for excuses. Yet his laughter rang hollow, an echo in an empty chamber. Richard knew then that denial was his last shield, and it was cracking. The moment shifted when Richard placed the forged authorization with his own name in front of him. Mark's eyes hardened, no longer pleading, but calculating. He accused Richard instead, twisting the accusation into a counterattack. He said the signature was real, that Richard had orchestrated the scheme and was now trying to pin it on him. The audacity of the lie hit Richard like a slap, and for a brief second he struggled to breathe. But Richard had anticipated this. He revealed copies of internal communications Mark thought destroyed, hidden backups that pointed directly at him. The room grew hotter as denial turned to fury. Mark pounded the desk, his voice booming, his words dripping with betrayal. He shouted about their friendship, about the years they had built together, as if time itself could erase the truth written in ink. Richard listened in silence, refusing to let anger dictate his hand. What cut deepest was not just the theft, but the intimacy of the betrayal. Richard remembered late nights, glasses of whiskey shared, advice exchanged like brothers. To know that those moments had been poisoned by deceit was almost unbearable. He felt the weight of every smile Mark had given him, every toast to success, now revealed as camouflage for greed. It was not just business that had been destroyed, but a bond he once believed unbreakable. Mark's voice broke when he realized the evidence was too strong. His bravado faltered, replaced by a bitter edge. He muttered about desperation, about opportunities he deserved but never received. He painted himself as a victim trapped in a system that undervalued him. Richard heard the excuses, but to him they were ash in the wind. No justification could erase the lives damaged, the trust shattered, the dignity stolen from honest workers. The confrontation ended not with shouting, but with a silence sharper than knives. Richard looked at Mark, not with rage, but with sorrow. He told him the truth would no longer be buried, that the company deserved light, no matter how painful it might be. Mark sneered, but the defeat in his eyes betrayed him. Richard knew the battle was only beginning, but the veil had finally been lifted. As Mark left the room, his shoulders stiff, his steps uneven, Richard felt both heavier and strangely lighter. He had lost a friend, but uncovered a truth that demanded justice. The walls of the office, once symbols of triumph, now felt like witnesses to a crime. Richard stood alone, staring at the door Mark had closed, knowing that betrayal had been faced, but the war for truth had only just begun. Richard knew denial alone would never bring Mark down. Lies had a way of slipping through fingers, vanishing when pressed too hard. He needed something solid, something that could not be twisted or burned. That night, under the dim light of his office, he met with a lawyer he trusted. The man listened carefully, his sharp eyes narrowing as the pieces were laid out. He suggested a path dangerous yet necessary. Lead Mark into a corner, record his words, and let the truth condemn him. The idea burned in Richard's mind. To trap Mark, he would have to pretend, to act as though their bond still held. It felt like swallowing poison, smiling through clenched teeth, while waiting for betrayal to reveal itself again. But Richard understood the stakes. Documents could be forged, accounts manipulated, but a voice trembling with confession carried a weight no pen could erase. He agreed, his jaw set, his resolve carved deeper than before. The plan was set with meticulous care, hidden devices positioned where they would catch every syllable, every breath. Richard practiced his role, questions cloaked in casual tones, words designed to lure without alarming. The lawyer reminded him that the trap was delicate, that one wrong move could send Mark fleeing into the shadows. Richard nodded, though inside, unease churned like a storm at sea. He was about to gamble everything on a single conversation. When the day came, Richard invited Mark into his office with the familiar ease of old times. He poured drinks, spoke of stress, of rumors spreading, of fear that the company was slipping. He let his voice tremble slightly, as though overwhelmed. Mark, sensing an opportunity, leaned in. His arrogance was a flame that had burned too long, and Richard knew it might finally consume him. He guided the conversation with careful hand, nudging, waiting. At first, Mark denied once more, his tone sharp, defensive. But Richard pushed softly, not accusing, just hinting that the walls were closing in. He spoke of employees whispering, of auditors who might arrive, of evidence that perhaps had not been destroyed after all. He let silence stretch heavy enough to press against the skin. And then, slowly, Mark's guard began to slip. His voice softened, turned bitter, almost nostalgic. Mark muttered about sacrifices, about the years he had given the company, about opportunities that never came his way. He spoke of money as if it were owed to him, as though theft were merely a form of balance. Richard said nothing, only nodded, encouraging him with quiet prompts. And then it happened. Mark admitted it, not in a burst, but in fragments, each word a nail hammered into his own coffin. He confessed to the scheme, to the accounts, to the threats. The recorder caught every word, every sigh, every hint of justification. Richard sat still, his heart pounding so hard he feared it would betray the ruse. But Mark, lost in his own monologue, never noticed. He even laughed at one point, recalling how easy it had been to forge documents, to plant false trails. The sound chilled Richard to the bone, the laughter of a man who thought himself untouchable. When the conversation ended, Mark left with a smirk, certain he still held control. Richard remained alone, the recording device heavy in his hand. Relief washed over him, sharp and raw. He had the truth now, spoken by the very man who had buried him in lies. But with the relief came fear. How long before Mark realized his mistake? How long before he struck back? The battle was far from over. The lawyer listened to the tape with solemn silence. When it ended, he nodded once, the gesture firm and resolute. They had what they needed to bring Mark before the law, but he warned Richard the path would be thorned. Men like Mark did not go quietly. They dragged others into the fire with them. Richard clenched his fist, ready to walk into the storm. For the first time in weeks, he felt the ground steady beneath his feet. The trap had been set, the truth captured. Yet Richard knew this victory was only a doorway, not the end. Mark would not crumble easily. Already Richard sensed retaliation brewing in the shadows. But no matter how fierce the counterattack, he now held the weapon Mark could never erase, his own voice, confessing sins in the safety of what he thought was secrecy. And with that, the stage was set for a battle that would test more than loyalty. It would test survival itself. The morning after the recording, Richard felt both armed and exposed. He carried proof that could burn through lies. Yet he also knew Mark would not surrender quietly. True enough, before Richard could act, the blow landed. Mark filed a legal complaint, accusing Richard of embezzlement and financial crimes. It was a ruthless strike, crafted to discredit him before the truth could breathe. Headlines began to stir, whispers filled the corridors, and Richard felt the weight of suspicion settle on his shoulders. Investigators arrived with sharp eyes and clipped voices. They combed through documents, offices, and computers, pulling apart years of work. Richard stood by, answering questions with steady words, but each moment felt like standing trial in his own home. Employees who once greeted him warmly now avoided his gaze. Doubt was a contagion spreading fast, and Mark had ensured Richard looked like the villain. The betrayal had left scars, but now it threatened to bury his name in ruin. The courtroom became the new battlefield. Lawyers clashed, their words striking like swords. Mark played his role with precision, portraying himself as the loyal manager forced to expose a corrupt owner. He painted Richard as greedy, ruthless, a man who had fed off the sweat of his workers. Each accusation was a dagger, twisting deeper into the fragile reputation Richard had spent decades building. For the first time, he wondered if truth would ever outweigh deception. The recording was powerful, yet Mark's lawyers fought to dismiss it. They argued it was coerced, incomplete, taken out of context. They tried to bury its weight beneath technicalities, to turn confession into ambiguity. Richard watched, his jaw tight, as lies danced in legal robes. He leaned on his own counsel, who reminded the court of the forged documents, the diverted accounts, the workers left unpaid. Piece by piece, they began to stitch the picture back together. Outside the courtroom, Richard's life unraveled. Friends avoided calls, clients withdrew contracts, banks whispered about closing lines of credit. His name, once a symbol of growth and integrity, now lingered in conversations like a stain. Even the employees who had once admired him wondered if the man they worked for had truly betrayed them. Richard carried the burden in silence, each day heavier than the last, clinging only to the fire of truth he had captured. The worst wound came when his own family questioned. Their eyes, once full of pride, now carried uncertainty. Richard did not blame them. He understood the power of appearances, how lies told loudly can sound like gospel. Still, it pierced him deeper than any legal threat. He swore to himself that he would not let Mark's treachery define his legacy. If he had to crawl through fire to clear his name, he would. Weeks turned into months, the battle grinding on. Evidence was dissected, witnesses called, arguments reshaped. Richard endured, sometimes barely, sometimes with fury pushing him forward. He thought often of Mary, of her tears by the safe, of her voice breaking under the weight of injustice. She reminded him why he fought, why surrender was never an option. This was no longer about a company alone. It was about dignity stolen and justice demanded. At times, Richard feared defeat, The system was slow, heavy, and easily swayed by those who knew how to bend it. Mark had played his hand well, striking first, poisoning Wells before Richard could defend himself. Yet truth has a patience lies can never match. Gradually, cracks began to show in Mark's story. Forensic analysts traced the accounts, exposing patterns too deliberate to dismiss. The tide, slow but certain, began to shift. Richard endured humiliation, suspicion, and sleepless nights. Yet beneath the rubble of his reputation, something unbreakable stirred. He found strength not in victory promised, but in the fight itself. Every day he stood, every accusation he faced, he chipped away at the shadow Mark had cast. Employees began to whisper differently now, wondering if perhaps they had judged too quickly. Seeds of doubt turned against the deceiver, and Richard knew the storm was nearing its climax. The legal battle was not just about guilt or innocence. It was about survival, about whether trust could rise again after being shattered. Richard walked into each hearing with his head high, knowing the cost of truth was steep but worth paying. And as the pieces slowly aligned, as evidence began to shine through the fog, he realized the war was no longer just for his name. It was for the soul of everyone who had been betrayed. The fight was not over, but justice was no longer a dream. It was a fire inching closer to the light. The courtroom drama had drained Richard, but the tide finally began to turn outside those walls. Forensic experts presented undeniable proof. The accounts traced directly to Mark, every transfer mapped with clinical precision. The employees who once doubted began to murmur differently, their eyes searching Richard's face, not with suspicion, but with shame for having believed the lies. Trust, fragile as glass, started to rebuild, though its cracks still showed in the light. Mary was the first to approach him, her voice trembling with both apology and gratitude. She told him that while fear had once silenced the workers, courage now demanded their voices be heard. Others followed one by one, sharing their stories openly, standing not as victims, but as witnesses. Each testimony chipped away at Mark's false narrative, and Richard felt something shift inside him. The company no longer saw him as a villain standing alone, but as a leader fighting beside them. What struck Richard most was how quickly loyalty could return when truth was given room to breathe. Employees who had walked with their heads low began to carry themselves differently. The despair that once poisoned the corridors gave way to cautious hope. It was not immediate nor complete, but it was real. Richard saw in their faces the reflection of his own determination, and for the first time in months, he believed redemption was possible. Yet trust demanded more than words. It demanded proof of care. Richard visited departments personally, sitting with workers in break rooms, listening to grievances that had long been ignored. He apologized without excuses, not for his own crimes, because he had none, but for the blindness that allowed betrayal to fester. Those moments, raw and unpolished, meant more than any court victory. They reminded the workers that he saw them, not just as employees, but as people whose lives mattered. It was during these visits that he uncovered the depth of Mark's treachery. Hidden beneath the financial fraud, another truth emerged. Mark had been using the company's name illegally, securing clients for personal gain, pocketing profits under false pretenses. Contracts, invoices, and deals carried the company's signature, but none of its benefit. It was a theft not only of money, but of reputation. Richard felt the fire of betrayal burn hotter, but also a grim satisfaction. Mark's empire of lies was collapsing. The discovery strengthened the employees' resolve. They realized they had not just been cheated out of wages, but used as pawns in a much larger scheme. Anger, once directed at Richard, now pointed squarely at Mark. The same voices that had doubted began to defend. The same eyes that once turned away now met his with renewed loyalty. The shift was slow but unstoppable, like dawn breaking after a long night. Richard knew the wounds would not heal overnight. Suspicion leaves scars, and scars carry memory. But he welcomed the slow process, for it was built on honesty, not illusion. He encouraged transparency, opening the books, sharing details once kept behind closed doors. Every act of openness was a brick laid in rebuilding the foundation, stronger than before because it no longer hid shadows. As weeks passed, the company felt different. The weight that had hung over the halls lifted, replaced by an energy Richard thought lost forever. Employees spoke with more confidence, laughter returned in small bursts, and projects began to move again. It was fragile still, but it was life, and life was enough to build on. Richard understood now that trust, once broken, could only be restored by actions repeated until doubt had no room to grow. Mary became a symbol of that renewal. Once invisible in her silence, she now stood as a quiet beacon of resilience. Her story had sparked Richard's fight, and now her presence reminded others that dignity could survive even the harshest betrayal. She walked the corridors with a steadier step, her head lifted just slightly higher, proof that the company was not just recovering, but changing. In the privacy of his office, Richard allowed himself a rare smile. The battle was not over. Justice still waited to be served in full, but the hardest part was behind him. He had faced betrayal, endured suspicion, and now felt the fragile warmth of trust returning. It was not victory yet, but it was a promise, and promises, when honored, have the power to rebuild what deceit tried so hard to destroy. The courtroom was hushed when the verdict was read. Richard sat motionless, his breath caught somewhere between hope and dread. Across the room, Mark shifted in his chair, his once proud shoulders slumped under the weight of truth, finally too heavy to deny. The judge's voice was steady, each word carving into the silence like a chisel against stone. Guilty, fraud, forgery, embezzlement, all confirmed beyond doubt. The sentence, 5 years in prison. The room exhaled as though it had been holding its breath for months. Mark's face darkened, his eyes darting around as if searching for a lifeline. For years he had controlled the narrative, twisting lies into truths, painting innocence as guilt. But now, stripped of his power, he was just a man caught in his own web. His lawyer whispered frantically, but no words could soften the gavel's final strike. For Richard, the sound was not triumph, but closure, the first real step toward healing what had been torn apart. Employees filled the gallery, their presence a quiet rebellion against the fear Mark once spread. Some wept, others whispered, their voices rising with relief. For them, this verdict was more than justice for Richard. It was justice for every unpaid hour, every humiliation, every night spent wondering how to feed their family. In that room, the balance of power shifted back to where it belonged, and Richard felt the weight of responsibility return with full force. As Mark was led away in handcuffs, he sneered once more, defiance flickering in his eyes. But the fire that had once intimidated now looked pitiful, a dying flame. Richard did not return the glare. There was no satisfaction in watching a former friend reduced to this. What had been destroyed could never be rebuilt, and the scars of betrayal would remain. Yet justice had spoken, and in its voice, Richard found a measure of peace. Reporters swarmed outside the courthouse, cameras flashing, questions hurled like stones. Richard stood tall, though exhaustion lined his face. He gave few words, not of revenge, but of responsibility. He spoke of the workers, of the lessons learned, of the need to rebuild trust. His message was clear. The company's future would not be defined by deceit, but by the resilience of those who had endured it. The headlines that followed painted not just scandal, but redemption. Inside the company, the verdict spread like wildfire. Relief washed through the halls, laughter returning where silence had once reigned. Employees walked taller, their faith in leadership cautiously reborn. The shadow of Mark's control no longer lingered, replaced by a cautious optimism. Richard watched as the company breathed again, each department rediscovering its rhythm. For the first time in a long while, the building felt alive. Yet Richard knew justice did not end with a prison sentence. True justice would come in rebuilding lives, in restoring dignity, in proving day by day that trust could be more powerful than greed. The court had punished the crime, but healing required more than laws. It required compassion. Richard carried that responsibility like a torch, determined never to let darkness take root in his company again. Mary approached him quietly after the verdict, her eyes shimmering with tears. She thanked him not just for fighting, but for listening, for believing her when no one else did. Richard clasped her hand, the gesture simple yet profound. In her gratitude, he saw the true measure of victory, not in headlines or verdicts, but in the lives touched by justice finally served. The memory of betrayal would never fully leave him. Late at night, he would still recall Mark's laughter, the forged signature, the lies spoken with confidence. But now, those memories no longer chained him. They served as warnings, reminders of what vigilance and integrity must guard against. Pain had forged resolve, and betrayal had birthed clarity. Justice had been served, but Richard knew the story was not over. The verdict was an end, yes, but also a beginning. The company's future stretched ahead, fragile yet full of possibility. And in that fragile hope, Richard found strength. He had faced betrayal, endured suspicion, fought for truth, and now stood ready to build anew. The gavel had fallen, but the work of redemption had only just begun. When the dust of the trial settled, Richard returned to his company, not as the same man who once walked those halls. The walls still carried echoes of betrayal, but now they also held the promise of change. He looked at the faces of his employees, people who had suffered quietly, and he knew that rebuilding trust would take more than words. It would demand proof of care day after day until wounds turned into scars that no longer bled. He began with programs that placed people at the center. A support fund was created for workers facing emergencies, so no one would ever again feel the desperation Mary had endured. Health benefits were expanded, wages reviewed with transparency, and a committee formed where employees had a voice in decisions that once belonged only to the top. Richard wanted the company to breathe differently, to carry the scent of fairness in every corner. For him, leadership was no longer about profit margins or quarterly reports. It was about looking into the tired eyes of workers and seeing the human stories behind them. He visited the floors often, not with speeches, but with conversations, listening more than he spoke. He found that dignity did not require grand gestures. Sometimes it was restored in the simple act of being heard. His presence, once distant, became familiar, grounding. Mary became a symbol of that new beginning. Richard ensured her wages were restored and her mother received proper medical care. But more than that, he honored her voice, recognizing her courage to speak when silence was safer. He shared her story in meetings not to expose her pain, but to remind everyone of the cost of ignoring injustice. Her resilience became a thread woven into the fabric of the company's rebirth. Richard also turned his attention outward. Invited to conferences, he spoke not of profits, but of trust, of how betrayal had nearly destroyed everything he had built. His lectures were raw, stripped of pretense, filled with lessons carved from scars. Leaders listened, some uncomfortably, as he insisted that power without accountability is rot waiting to spread. He was no longer just a businessman. He had become a messenger of ethics in a world too eager to look away. The employees noticed the change. They saw their boss walking the halls with humility, not authority, with curiosity, not command. They felt the weight of his sincerity in every initiative, every adjustment. Slowly, the fear that once poisoned their work faded. What remained was a cautious pride, the kind that grows not from slogans, but from shared survival. Richard felt it too, a new rhythm in the heartbeat of the company. Still, he never forgot the scars. At night, when the offices were dark, he would sit alone in his chair and remember the laughter he once shared with Mark. The pain of betrayal had not vanished, but it had been reshaped into resolve. He understood that friendship without integrity is an illusion, and that trust, though fragile, is the strongest foundation a company can rest upon. To ensure the lessons were never forgotten, Richard created an internal program of mentorship. Experienced workers guided newcomers, not just in tasks, but in values. Stories of the past, both victories and wounds, were passed down so that memory itself became a safeguard. Richard believed that remembering was a form of protection, and forgetting was an invitation for history to repeat. The company began to flourish again, but differently. Success was measured not only in contracts signed, but in lives supported, in families that no longer feared losing everything because of someone's greed. The corridors no longer echoed with silence and suspicion, but with conversations, with laughter, with the steady hum of work carried out with dignity. Richard knew profits would follow, but for the first time, they were no longer his first concern. He carried the lesson everywhere he went. A business is only as strong as the trust it protects. Money can build walls, but only honesty builds a home. Richard had lost a friend, endured betrayal, and faced ruin, yet what rose from the ashes was stronger than anything he had imagined. It was not just a company reborn. It was a community where people mattered, where loyalty was honored, and where truth at last had found its place. Richard often stood by the window of his office, looking out at the city lights that once felt distant but now seemed alive with meaning. He thought of the battles fought, the betrayals endured, and the trust that had been painstakingly rebuilt. In those quiet reflections, he understood a truth he wished he had seen earlier. The true wealth of a company is not locked in safes or counted in ledgers. It beats in the hearts of the people who carry it forward. He no longer measured success by the numbers glowing on reports. Instead, he saw it in Mary's steady smile, in employees who now walked with their heads high, in the simple pride of work done with dignity. Profit was necessary, yes, but it was not the soul of the enterprise. Without honesty, even the greatest fortune crumbles into dust. Richard knew now that leadership meant protection, not possession. When he spoke at company gatherings, his words carried a different weight. He reminded everyone that betrayal could hide in plain sight, but so could loyalty. He urged them to hold each other accountable, to build an environment where fear could not grow in silence. His voice trembled sometimes, not with weakness, but with the gravity of a man who had seen how close destruction could come when trust is abandoned. The programs he had created became more than policies. They were lifelines. Support funds, transparent wages, and open-door conversations were not just measures of management, but promises carved into action. Employees began to see the company not as a machine of profit, but as a place where their humanity mattered. Richard found pride not in expansion charts, but in knowing no one would again be forced to choose between survival and silence. Beyond the walls of his business, he became a voice others sought. At universities, in auditoriums, at conferences, he spoke of ethics as if it were oxygen, unseen yet vital. He told stories of betrayal and redemption, of how easy it was to look away until the rot grew too strong to ignore. His message struck deep because it was not theory. It was carved from pain, lived in nights without sleep, healed only through resilience. The employees carried his message too. They became guardians of the culture he had reshaped, whispering reminders to newcomers. Here, honesty matters. The legacy of Mark's deceit was never erased, but it was transformed into vigilance. They had survived the shadow, and in surviving, they became stronger together. Richard found comfort in that, knowing the story of their struggle was no longer just his burden, but their collective strength. For Richard, the lesson would never fade. Trust, once broken, could be rebuilt, but only through relentless care. It was fragile, yet it was also the most powerful currency a leader could hold. He learned that a company thrives not because it grows richer, but because it grows closer to its people. The balance sheets might capture numbers, but the true measure of success lived in the eyes of those who believed again. As the years passed, Richard's story became more than a chapter of scandal. It became a testament that betrayal, no matter how deep, cannot drown those who choose integrity, a testament that greed may wound, but honesty heals, and a testament that leadership, when rooted in compassion, can transform ruins into foundations stronger than stone. He often wondered what might have happened had Mary taken the money from that open safe. Perhaps the truth would have remained hidden. Perhaps the company would have rotted from within until nothing was left. But she had not. Her tears had been the spark that lit the fire of change. Richard never forgot that, and he made sure no one else did either. The final message was clear. The real success of a company is not counted in profit stacked high, but in trust built deep in care for people and in the honest ground where dignity takes root. That truth had cost Richard nearly everything, but in the end, it had given him back far more. And in that truth, he found not only redemption, but a purpose that would outlast him. And so Richard's story closes not with silence, but with renewal. What began as suspicion in the quiet of an open safe unfolded into a storm of betrayal, pain, and resilience. He faced the collapse of his reputation, the sting of false accusations, and the loneliness of being doubted by those he trusted most. Yet through every wound, the truth prevailed. Justice was served, and more than that, a company rediscovered its soul. What do you think about this journey you've just witnessed? Did the weight of betrayal strike you as deeply as it struck those who lived it? Or perhaps it stirred questions about your own life, about where trust stands, about the unseen sacrifices of those around you? Share your thoughts below. Your voice matters as much as the story itself. If this tale touched you, I invite you to stay with us. On this channel, you'll find other stories just as emotional, each one filled with conflict, discovery, and the kind of revelations that keep hearts racing. Subscribe, leave your like, and activate the notification so you won't miss the next journey. For now, thank you for walking beside Richard, for feeling the weight of his fall and the triumph of his rise. This story may end here, but many others wait to be told, each carrying truths that speak beyond the surface. I'll see you in the next video. Until then, take care.